Look at it one way. Generally, we're a lot richer than we were. Once upon a time, only a tiny privileged elite didn't live in conditions that would today be classed as extreme poverty. Now only a minority do live that way, and their numbers are shrinking. Look at this chart based on a World Bank report. Back in 1990, nearly 2 billion people were extremely poor. By last year, that figure was well under 1 billion, still high, but under 10% of the world's population. That's largely due to a huge decline in poverty in Asia, although in sub-Saharan Africa it's changed little. Europe, on the other hand, barely registers on the scale. Now, extreme poverty is defined as living on under $1.90 a day. Now, clearly incomes in Europe are well above that figure, but so too is the cost of living. The World Bank has a grading system based on countries' wealth. It lists them in several categories by measuring national income per head of population. Europe only begins featuring in the third upper middle income bracket. Here, the poverty line is set at $5.50 a day. In Bulgaria and Romania, the EU's poorest nations, figures have suggested nearly a quarter of people live below it. All other EU countries are graded high-income economies, with the poverty standard set at over $20 a day. But income, of course, is only part of the picture. Take into account material and social deprivation as well, and figures suggest that more than 20% of people across Europe are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. In the poorest nations on the left, well over a third of people are exposed. At the other end of the scale, a much lower proportion of the population is deemed at risk. Now, employment used to be seen as a way out of poverty, but some argue that's no longer the case. The European Anti-Poverty Network, representing many organisations, has done a major report on social exclusion. Here's its director, Leo Williams, on the rise of in-work poverty and other factors.
We're seeing an explosion of precarious work, of zero-hour contracts, the muck jobs, if you like, of Uber, Deliveroo, which means more and more people are working but are really struggling to make ends meet at the end of the month. It's about the access to key services and rights as well. So things like access to education, access to housing, access to social protection systems, so unemployment benefits, minimum income, access to social services. All of these kind of things are sort of the package of what people experiencing poverty and social exclusion have to face.
To help measure the problem, the figures consider something called work intensity, the actual amount of time spent working compared to the total amount of time that could have been spent at work. Across the EU, the number of people living in households whose members work very little, where work intensity is very low, has come down. Take Ireland and Greece, for example. Both suffered badly from the financial crisis, but the figures show an improvement as people began working more. These aren't the same as unemployment figures. For instance, the UK has a bigger work intensity problem than France, even though France has a higher jobless rate. Some of the EU's best performers under this measure are in Central Europe. Now, another factor measuring poverty and social exclusion is what people can actually afford. People are said to suffer severe material deprivation if, for example, they have trouble paying the bills, if they can't afford a week's annual holiday away from home, if they don't have enough for a decent meal every second day, if they can't afford a phone or a TV, a washing machine or a car, or if there's not enough money to heat their home. Again, the figures suggest a slight improvement. The percentage of people experiencing such problems has come down. But across the European Union, millions of people are still at risk, and many are exposed not just to one of these factors, but to two or even all three. Campaigners argue the real numbers are actually higher, as some of the most vulnerable groups, such as migrants and asylum seekers, don't appear. A decade ago, the EU set out key objectives in its Europe 2020 strategy, a new 10-year plan. They included poverty and social exclusion. The goal was to lift at least 20 million people out of this category by next year, but the latest figures suggest only around 5 million have been. Campaigners argue there's a fundamental link between poverty and growing inequality. They say that the gap between rich and poor in Europe, although it's not as bad as in North America, is still unacceptable. And they believe now is the time for world leaders to adopt a new strategy.
We really see that this is going to need a paradigm shift away from austerity and towards social investment. So, here we're talking about social protection, social services, quality jobs, redistribution, tackling tax evasion, tax avoidance. The timing is quite good for this now. We have the G7 coming up shortly, and we have new political leaders in the European Union as well. So it's really time for them, I think, to commit to poverty eradication and really to commit to fully implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in Europe.
Our correspondents around Europe and beyond have been reporting on the impact of poverty and inequality in their countries. Follow our coverage on Euronews and Euronews.com.